This is our next to last speaker, but what a delight to introduce Charles Locke, professor in English literature, and much more. I think Charles is the ideal humanistic scholar. He's a polymath. We have worked together over 9 years. Our first work together was organizing the conference Orthodoxy and Innovation in the Greek-speaking world from Byzantium to the 21st century. It was a conference we organized in memory of Sophia Skopetea, which was the first time, I got to know Charles and realized that apart from being a professor in English literature, he was a scholar widely knowledgeable in Byzantine studies, in iconography, in a lot of aspects of Orthodox Christianity. Mainly we work together on Greek themes, or we only work together on Greek themes, but occasionally I have a chance to hear about some of all the other scholarly interests of Charles, like apocryphal literature, petroglyphs in Italy, Russian colonization in Alaska. All of these three are lectures or papers that will be presented or published within the coming few months. I admire you, and thank you for working with me. You will speak now about redeeming the Romaic, Patrick Leigh Fermor, and the idea of Greece. Thank you, Charles.
Well, we've heard about the young Paddy and the old Paddy, what you do with the diaries that you found, that you wrote 30 years ago when you've just found them. How do you reconcile the knowledge you have now with the knowledge that you had then? I'm afraid I feel much the same about the paper I wrote earlier this week, because what I have learnt about Paddy in the last 24 hours and a little more makes me feel considerably older and better informed, or at least makes my younger self look very naive and foolish. So I thought I would revise not the theme, but I would have to revise some of the arguments that I was making, that I would have been making, and in particular to address what I think is a problem actually that I think needs to be addressed. Maybe not in this audience, but somebody did whisper to me in a good-humoured way, well, he's just an upper-class English toff, isn't he? And there is certainly this sense that one might have, especially given the guest list, their holiday companions and so on, that we've just heard about in Adam's talk, and indeed in the talk in Evita's talk, the sort of people that they hung out with. And it's easy to I think to sort of fall into that, or to put him in that category, and put him to one side. Also, I think we talk a great deal about him. We've heard a lot of talk about him as a hero, a war hero, which he certainly was. And there's again a sense that he came a bit too late to enjoy the status of a Kitchener or even of a Lawrence of Arabia. But then I was thinking, we've also heard a great deal about vacillation and prevarication, Adam's terms, for why he had such difficulty getting things finished. And yet he wrote compulsively, at least in the letters and so on and so on. He couldn't stop writing. So there's a strange paradox in somebody who can't stop writing but cannot meet a deadline, set a limit of words, can never stay within that limit, turns an article into a book, and so on and so on. Now this we might just put down to a temperamental difficulty, but I've been thinking that the two books that we were looking at yesterday, the one which exposes him, which discloses his life as a hero in the Cretan resistance, abducting a general, and the book that completes the trilogy, The Broken Road, that both of these books are posthumous, and that we need not necessarily think of them as simply unfinished for what we might call temperamental or psychological reasons. And I'm concerned in thinking about the Hellenic and the Romaic, thinking about how Leigh Fermor tries to construct some understanding of what it is to be a modern Greek, which I think is a topic that obsesses him for many decades. I'm concerned that we take his failure to reach or to record his reaching of Constantinople, or to recount it in that third volume, not as something contingent, accidental, or to be put down to temperament or even marketing forces, public demand, and so on, but rather to think of it in intellectual or even spiritual terms. That it represented a problem, maybe a disappointment, as Artemis said, a disappointment, the sort of anticlimax of reaching the end, but also perhaps a sense that this was not the goal that he had been looking for, that it represented a different sort of destination, one which no longer conformed to his idea of what he ought to have been looking at, or what he ought to have found in Constantinople. And for this, I think it worth going back to the first publication, A Traveller's Tree, and to see the relationship between the sheer difficulty of being a modern Greek when you've got the ancient Greece on top of you, dominating your life, dominating your education, dominating your whole sense of culture, not only within Greece, but most especially within Western civilization, that your job as a modern Greek is, as it were, to be worthy of the ancient Greeks. And after all, it was only for that reason that we, Western Europeans, came to rescue you from the Ottoman Empire in order that Greece might be free, in Byron's words, but free, as it were, to recreate Periclean Athens and so forth. Now, what if this was a sense that Leigh Fermor had when he set out from England, a sense inspired by a very interesting group of English writers who were the first in England to take a positive interest in Byzantium, so that Byzantium had been ignored for a few hundred years and then flamboyantly despised by Voltaire, by Gibbon, by Leakey in a more scholarly manner in the 19th century, and by everybody else. It was just taken for granted that Byzantium was the worst place, the worst form of civilization there had ever been, and so on and so on. Up until the late 19th, early 20th century, when you get certain scholars, very few, many of them in Russia, who, as it were, watching the opening up of Orthodox nations, the emergence of Orthodox nations out of the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, all, of course, countries that Paddy walked through in the 1930s and lived in. Russia watches these and realizes that Russia is no longer the only independent Orthodox nation, has to deal with these other ones, and therefore sets up a notion of some sort of connection to Byzantium and creates a Byzantine identity, one which is established, affirmed at enormous length and detail and scholarly and rhetorical panache by the great Romanian historian Nicolae Iorga in his Byzance après Byzance of 1935, exactly the time of Paddy's walk. Now this means that the revalidation of Byzantium, or the recognition of the value of Byzantium, is something that's been taking place, starting with the Russians, going on with the Germans, many of them writing, actually a number of them being Russian emigres writing in German in the 1920s, reaching England in the 1920s with the with the earliest of the scholars. I think the earliest scholar to hold a chair in Byzantine studies who respects Byzantine studies. There had been others who either despised it or who simply said, well, they were classical scholars, they've been appointed to a chair of Byzantine studies, but so what? They will carry on working with classical scholarship because the Byzantine doesn't deserve their attention. But the first one to hold such a position was Richard Dawkins, not to be confused, no relation as far as I know, but Richard Dawkins was professor of Byzantine studies at Oxford, and Leigh Fermor had read his work and consulted him later on, and so on. So he was an early inspiration, as was, of course, Robert Byron, whose Byzantine achievement is itself an absolutely astonishing achievement for a man of, I think, 24 or 25 years old. He wrote two books by the age of 24, 25. One, The Byzantine Achievement, about 300 pages, which simply declares Byzantium to be the greatest form of civilization the world has ever known. It is a fantastically good polemic, a superb piece of writing, and one which I think stands up, certainly as a work of literature, stands up to the present and is still, I believe, in print. He also wrote a book called The Station, which is about the visit to Mount Athos that he had undertaken with David Talbot Rice and one other. It was, we heard about it yesterday from Artemis. What's the name? Who gave him the rucksack which was stolen in Munich. Yes, right. So this journey to Mount Athos was again an opening up of the last surviving part of the Byzantine world that was sort of somehow politically untouched or largely untouched. Is, I believe, the first book on Mount Athos to be published in English. It was followed soon after by a book by Talbot Rice and Byron called The Birth of Western Painting, which argues that Western art, Renaissance art, does not come, as everybody supposed, from classical models, the revival of the classical world, and so on, but rather it comes from Byzantine painting. This, I think, is now largely a truism in the history of art, that Duccio and Giotto had looked at Byzantine icons and so forth, or earlier than Duccio, in the 12th, 13th centuries. And so this established a sense of Byzantium, which was then built on by other scholars whom Patrick Leigh Fermor also knew. One of them we heard about in Artemis's talk, Stephen Runciman. Another was the American Thomas Whittemore. And then later on, the professor of Byzantine studies, Byzantine history, Byzantine and Russian history at Oxford, Dmitry Obliensky, who gave him a considerable amount of advice in his later years, so that there is a continuity of a great sympathy with Byzantium and keeping up with the leading scholars in Byzantine studies. But one of the things that interests me is that if you head for Constantinople, you are expecting to find Byzantium. You don't find it. You find a Turkish city which goes by a name he would never pronounce. And from there, he goes to Mount Athos, which is where the broken road ends. So that there is a sense that the achieving of Byzantium is somehow, or remains, the end of the journey remains elusive, and that he's not prepared to go along with Robert Byron's view of Byzantium, which is then a sort of an alternative that is being offered to the Greeks, that the Greeks can simply become Byzantine. They can take Byzantium as their model. This is surely better than the classical model. And this is something which a number of Greek thinkers have, of course, often advocated. but it has never been, of course, never been politically a very acceptable model. And it seems to me that the Byzantine model is identified by Leigh Fermor earlier than by anybody else, at least in the English tradition of Byzantine writing, as not an adequate model. And I compare this with sort of Stephen Runciman and such people, or even Obolensky's great work of Balkan history, the Byzantine Commonwealth, where there is a sense in which this provides a more recent model, it provides an identity, there is a continuity of the Orthodox Church that, as it were, preserves a certain notion of the ethnos and of social values through the social and symbolic values, through the Turkocracy, the domination of the Turks from 1453 through to 1829 in the case of Greece, and a little bit later in the case of Bulgaria and Romania, so that the identity that one can appeal to certain things to say these countries have an identity which nations have an identity which can be traced through the Ottoman period back to a time when they were part of the Byzantine Empire, and out of this some sort of new identity can be made. Leigh Fermor does not go along with that, and instead comes up with the idea of the Romaic, which he insists on most of all in Romaic, but which is a theme running all through. And this Romaic, although it's a name which comes from Byzantium, that is to say, Byzantium thought of itself, or should I say, Constantinople thought of itself as the second Rome and of its people as Romans. The people thought of themselves as Romans. It is one of the great enduring illusions under which we live, that anything Roman must be good and anything Byzantine must be bad, so that most people in the street, if not in the common rooms of this world, believe Roman law to be something that comes from Rome, when of course we all know, if we think about it, that it comes from Justinian, and that it should therefore, by rights, be known as Byzantine law, but we couldn't possibly call it by such a pejorative term, so it is one aspect of Byzantium that continues to be called by its proper name, Roman law. So Rome is the name of Byzantium as the second Rome. The people, the Rumeli, are known, and this is how all sorts of names derived from Rome spread across Greece, across the Balkans, and indeed it is how is one of the ways in which the Ottomans referred to the Christian population of the Byzantine Empire that they conquered in 1453. So, although the history of the word takes us all the way back to Byzantium, the way in which it's used from the 18th century onwards, at least as it comes into use in English and French, is as a linguistic term, and it is of the vulgar speech. So that by the time you get to the person we hear so much about, not Robert Byron, but Lord Byron, they were not relatives either, by the way, but Robert Byron did not find it to his disadvantage that he was thought to be related. When we get to Lord Byron, he says that he makes a distinction between modern Greek and Romaic. So Romaic, he says, is vulgar and so on. And this is the arguments about the Greek language go on and on, and I wouldn't attempt to explain them. I don't hardly understand them. But the term Romaic becomes a linguistic term, and it then becomes a pejorative term. It's sort of almost slang. It's very vulgar, and it's the sort of thing which is simply not the written language, the language of popular culture, of course, years before anyone thought popular culture was worth consideration. Now, it seems to me that when we see, as we have seen pictures of Leigh Fermor, I'll call him Leigh Fermor as an author because I want to think of him not as Paddy, but as an author and even as an intellectual. When we see, and my point is, when we see Leigh Fermor dancing and singing and so on, he is, as it were, and we heard this also in Adams talking about the letters, the enjoyment of aristocratic company, but also the enjoyment of the demotic, of the taverna, and so on and so on. You've got a sense that this is where you have to find, not, I won't say the real Greece or whatever, where you find something that valorizes the way in which people actually live in Greece without intimidating them. As he says, the way in which Greeks live, they have to bear comparison with Plato and Homer and all the rest of it. He says it's like going to England and expecting everybody to be dressed in Elizabethan costume, or watching a busload of persons getting out of a bus and saying, not a single Druid among them. He says, he explains how it must be for modern Greeks. And I think that this is something which obsessed him, which he argues very, very forcefully in Romaic, and which I don't think he resolves. But I would say, I mean, my argument in part would be that the difficulty of concluding what we now know as the broken road was actually a difficulty of resolving what it is that he really hoped his destination would be, that his destination would in some sense be the resolution of his own problem of, as it were, identity or whatever, the sense of where value should lie. And he goes from Constantinople to Mount Athos. He'd barely touched on Greece. I'm not sure that he had been in Greece on the walk itself. Well, he'd been in Greece, but he'd been in Greece, but it wasn't part of the walk to Constantinople. It's rather the idea of recreating, of getting to the ancient Byzantium. So the prevarication seems to me, I mean, we could argue, and I'd like to argue, that it is much more an intellectual uncertainty, skepticism about what it is that he's trying to prove by a walk, rather than simply distractions, alcohol, and all the other excuses that we can find for various unfinished books. And I would want to relate that, well, there are 2 points I'd want to relate it to. One, the fact that, which is the other book that we heard a lot about yesterday, Abducting a General. His colleague in arms, Billy Moss, wrote Ill Met by Moonlight in 1950. It was turned into a film. This is a typical pattern of war memoirs. It seems, and there are thousands of them, written in the late 1940s, early 1950s. It seems to me that Leigh Fermor did everything not to be known as a war hero. He enjoys the film, he enjoys talking about it in the correspondence, but if you actually look at public knowledge of it in the 1940s, 1950s, I quoted that novel by Francis King. Everyone in Crete helped to abduct the general. But it seems to me that that this was largely within circles, within fairly limited circles. It only became public knowledge with the publication of A Time of Gifts, and has since become part of the image of Leigh Fermor as adventurer, war hero, and so on and so forth. But that had Leigh Fermor been another sort of person, he could easily have, as it were, capitalized on his war experiences and written or published his report, his account of abducting a general in the late 40s, and have become famous for that. In many ways, you could see a sort of the career of somebody like Lawrence of Arabia, somebody going native, mixing with the natives, working with the natives, and so on and so on. Leigh Fermor resisted it, and I think we must recognize that we are actually creating, and I say this without intending any criticism of those who have edited these books, because they are here with us and we're very pleased to have them here with us. But in a sense, both The Broken Road and Abducting a General create an image of Leigh Fermor as something more or other than he wished to present himself as. And I think we need to think, as it were, to go back even through the letters that say, oh yes, I wish I could finish the book, and so on, so on, the agony of the incomplete. But I would want to go back to the experience that immediately followed the Second World War for Leigh Fermor. After his time in Athens with the British Council, when he went on the sort of photographic tour of the Caribbean, in which he was supposed merely to provide captions to his future wife's photographs, and produced The Traveller's Tree. Now, The Traveller's Tree is a book, I suppose, known to Leigh Fermor's admirers, but not much known to others, though it has now been reissued, I think by the New York Review, rather than by... Is it in print in Britain now? No. But it has been reissued in New York by the New York Review of Books. And it seems to me that this book about the Caribbean, well, everybody who's interested in Patrick Leigh Fermor is interested either in the sort of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Danube, Rhine, aristocracy, and so on and so on, that wonderful world that he evokes, or in Greece. Who's interested in the Caribbean? It doesn't quite match. So I won't ask you how many people here have read it, but I suspect not many. The point is that it is actually one of the first books to identify the problems of British colonies emerging from the British Empire. And it's, I think, probably the earliest book in English to identify the Rastafarians as a possible source of cultural symbolic interest for an emerging Jamaica. He is full of praise for Aimé Césaire, for the concept of Negritude, and I think, I haven't come across anybody else who noticed this, but I can see a number of allusions to the Traveller's Tree in the poetry of Derek Walcott. Now, this suggests to me that whatever, in a sense, it's obviously going to be taken, somebody like Derek Walcott is going to read it because there's almost nothing written about the West Indies. You could read everything written about the West Indies by 1950, or would occupy a shelf, probably, a small shelf. So that it's no surprise that Derek Walcott would read it, but it seems to me there are some quite affirmative or non-contesting, or perhaps only mildly contesting allusions to it. Now, if we think of this book as, in some sense, the key to everything that followed in Leigh Fermor's life, we can see that he'd had his dream of Constantinople, a dream of Constantinople which, as it were, was not to be realized there, which he then tried to defer and hope to realize on Mount Athos, and so on and so on. Then he gets concerned with the Romaic. Let's go back to the West Indies, the Caribbean, and say, here are newly emerging nations coming out of colonial dependence, having to find an identity for themselves that is different from Englishness, the Englishness, especially of Barbados, which he frankly deplores in a most surprising way. And if he could, that this gives him a sense of the sheer difficulty of emerging from one, shall we say, civilizational norm or some sort of symbolic cultural norm of Britishness, the British identity, the British Empire and so forth, or Byzantium. How do you emerge from this? What are you going to take as your models? What are you going to, as it were, carry over into the new nation? What are you going to reject? And so forth. So it seems to me that the problem that he addresses in Mani and Romaic, the problem of distinguishing between the Hellenic and the Romaic, as he presents it in that great sort of dialectical chapter, almost double column accounting that he presents, is one which he is thinking about through the lens of the traveller's tree and what he'd experienced there. And I mean, it only needs to be pointed out in terms of his prevarication, dilatoriness, and everything else, that he traveled to the Caribbean in 47, 48, and published The Traveller's Tree in 1950. And it's a long book, so there's no sign of hesitation there. He knows what he's doing there. He